Good afternoon, and welcome to our triple header this afternoon. And this has all been put together by my longtime friend and collaborator, Anthony Pienta, from the Philanthropy Roundtable. And so I'm going to ask Anthony to introduce this first team of presenters, and of course, you'll have ample opportunity to interact with them on the topic at hand.
Thank you, Father. Father Peter has a long history of twisting my arm, asking me to help out in various ways. So I'm happy to do that. Let me give you a background, the genesis of the discussion, why we're here, what I do, why this matters. So the Philanthropy Roundtable is we're a national network of about 700 philanthropists around the country, of all stripe and background. It just so turns out that a number of foundations, philanthropists, are actually interested in Catholic schools. What can happen to a city when you have an educated citizenry, when you have students that are graduating at very high rates, who happen to be morally formed in a strong way, who tend to do things like vote at higher rates and have stable families and a whole host of things. They're very interested in that, having options for kids to attend. So there's a value of Catholic schools above and beyond what I think what we see most kind of readily in front of us, kind of what it can do for society. My job at the Roundtable is to help donors, get them good information. We do a lot of introductions, provide them with information on what's happening in other parts of the country, and that's part of what when Father Peter and I were talking, what kind of generated this discussion, which is basically to say. There's a lot of trends happening in Catholic schools. Part of my job is to follow those along with education trends that are happening above and beyond private or independent schools. But it's good to know what's happening. It just so happens that in Philadelphia, in this region, there are a number of things happening represented in this discussion and the discussions afterwards it's a bit of a microcosm, I guess you could say, for other trends throughout the country. So we're going to dig into some of those, just so you know what's happening, good, bad, and indifferent. Some of the trends are positive, encouraging. Some of them are just good to know about, kind of promise and peril at the same time. So the first one, there's three discussions. The first one, we're going to look at some of the combination of alternate governance and alternate operational models that are happening, different ways in order to keep Catholic schools sustainable. Second discussion is going to be, how do you get inside the mind of a philanthropist? And quick say, there's kind of, you've seen one donor, one foundation. You've seen one donor, one foundation. So we'll get as far as we can with that one. And then we'll close by getting into the topic of publicly funded school choice. What programs exist? What do they look like? Pros and cons. How to anticipate, how to grow. Make sure they're set up in ways that are beneficial to Catholic schools. So with that, a quick introduction to myself. I grew up in Michigan. I have 4 kids with one on the way. We say we're building a hockey team. And right now, so we've been in the Washington, D.C. area for about 7 years. My kids do go to Catholic schools, and actually this is relevant. This actually follows up from the discussion at lunch. My kids go to an independent Catholic school as well. It's actually a Catholic Montessori school. Just as there's a lot of classical schools, there's a number of Catholic Montessori schools that are also getting going. I'm happy to go down that path at some point if it makes sense. Let me introduce my good friends who are also here speaking today. Let me start with Beth, Vice President of Operations at the Healy Education Foundation. And she'll go into a little bit more detail about what they're doing, but the foundation has some interesting partnerships with the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and I believe 4 other states. I think Minnesota was just added. So New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and now Minnesota. They serve over 100 elementary and high schools across those dioceses and those states. She'll get into details exactly what that looks like. Beth comes from Newman University and is also a graduate of the Catholic Leadership Institute, the Catholic Heroes Journey Program, which is also based here in Philadelphia. Casey Carter, to my right, is the CEO of the Faith in the Future Foundation, which is 17 high schools and 4 schools of special education in the Archdiocese. He'll get into more details about what that is and how it came about. Before that, he was president of National Heritage Academies, which is a charter school management company based in Michigan that operates over 75 schools in the United States. He's also, interestingly, it's a great book I recommend, the author of On Purpose, How Great School Cultures Form Strong Character and No Excuses. So lessons from 21 high-performing, high-poverty schools. It's also frequently printed as has columns in more than 180 newspapers and magazines. Studied for a license in theology at Oxford University and a doctorate in philosophy at the Catholic University of America. Getting on to Anne at my far left is the CEO of Independence Mission Schools, which runs a whole selection of K-8 Catholic schools in the Archdiocese. She joined Independence Mission Schools after a career with SunGuard Data Systems and later with Marlin Equity Partners. She's a Philadelphia native and a product of the Archdiocesan school system. A 1988 graduate of Boston College. Those are all the details for now. Let's get started. Actually, I want to start with Anne. I'll go back to you. Give us a sense, Independence Mission Schools, tell us the story. What happened? How did you end up there? What are you doing? Give us the basic narrative to start.
Sure. So at Independence Mission Schools, we are just about to start our 4th year running 15 former parish schools across the city of Philadelphia. We were formed really out of crisis in the Archdiocese. They had about 8 or 9 schools that they had been supporting from downtown, basically, for many, many years. And in 2012, they really figured they couldn't keep that going. We had a group of our board of directors had in 2010 very quietly assumed responsibility for one school in North Philadelphia. They had come to the school, gotten invested in it, and really were worried about getting too far in with the Archdiocese maintaining the right to close the school. So they negotiated a deal which became the template for the formation of mission schools 2 years later. We basically assumed all responsibility for the parish school bar the pastoral responsibility. So the school closed in June as a parish school, opened in September as an Independence Mission School. Most of the staff came over, the students came over, and really the real shift was to say, let's put a group of schools together and we'll be able to afford a central office that can service those schools fully. Their financial needs, their business needs, their fundraising needs, one central professional staff supporting that whole system, and keep the tie to the parish being the Catholic identity and the pastoral role of the pastor. Easier said than done. It was a very short transition time. We took 15 schools at once. We took 14 schools the first year, and we took the 15 schools the second year. So it by nature of that, it was there was not a lot of dialogue with individual parishes about what the nature of the deal would be. It was like, here's the deal. And for some of them, it was like, here's the deal, take it, or you're going to close your school. The interesting thing is that was only about 8 or 9 of our schools. The other schools actually opted in to try this new model. And I think in general, speaking from our side and from their side, no one knew quite what would happen. We had a positive experience at one school. We had a theory that if you could afford some of these services across a network of schools, you would be able to support them better. But we had to prove a lot of that. So I'm happy to say 3 years in that bold leap really has paid off in many ways in terms of the sustainability of the schools. We have over 1,000 more students in our schools. So when we started, we had about 3,800 students. Next year, we'll have more than 5,000 students. We've made tremendous investments across the schools. We had schools that were losing about $2 million a year before we took them over collectively. This year and next year, those same schools will be in a reserve position of in excess of $1 million. I think the most powerful thing about putting them together, to be honest, was offering the outside world a platform to see what the Catholic Church had been doing in poor neighborhoods for so long. I mean, I think that's really the core of it, is that in many ways in those first couple of years, people were knocking on our door. How can I help you? How can I help you service these children? And they never had an easy entrance point to reach this audience. And so I think that was the core of our early success, and now we're really trying to build on that while trying to really maintain that bridge and that pure Catholic identity in these schools.
Yeah, thanks. And one follow-up question. So what is different about the way kind of the day-to-day in the school? to someone who's attending, to parents, would it appear to be the same, or is it?
So I think the big difference from a parent standpoint is that the biggest thing we did that's different to parents is that I think the personnel feels the same. Two big differences. One is that the whole interface with the family is fairly different. We put a lot of structure in that was designed for families living in poverty. When we took over the schools, we had a lot of structure that was designed for Catholic families. We don't have a lot of Catholic families. We don't have Catholic multi-child families in the city. We have poor people trying to have a safe and faith-based option for their child. That's what we have. So we had to really embrace that. The mission of these schools and the foundation of these schools was a scholarship model for poor kids. And so we changed our structure. So instead of trying to keep a tuition rate very low, we have an income scale. And we have a college model. We have a stated tuition rate, and nobody does that. But it enables us to put the scholarship money through and optimize it effectively. So that's a big difference to the families, is that whole discussion, it was much more embracing of the reality of the families that were coming to us, as opposed to here's a stated tuition, here's some places you could go apply for a scholarship, good luck with that. It was really, that was the big thing. I think the second thing that they see is that in general, these schools, when we assumed them, were because they were losing so much money, they had really cut everything. They were keeping the doors open, and in a lot of cases, not a lot more. And because we've been able to push more funding through them, we've been able to make investments. So we've added assistant principals in many cases. We've added additional teaching resources. We've added literacy support in the early grades. I think they see a lot more investment happening for their children.
Okay, thanks. We'll return to you, Ann. In a minute, I want to hear Casey. So same story, Faith in the Future Foundation. And just a historical note, I believe you guys, both organizations, started at the same time, if I'm not mistaken.
Just to keep it confusing for
That's right.
everybody in the market, yes.
And that might be the easiest way to answer it. So Faith in the Future's story, both in its history, in its purpose, and in its approach, really parallels Ann's story of Independence Mission Schools. For those of you who are here, I was minding my own business in Washington, D.C. when this all happened, but Archbishop Chaput had just come to town, and what preceded that was the work of the Independent Blue Ribbon Commission, which, in addition to all the other news that the Archbishop was handed upon his arrival, the recommendation was close 4 of your high schools and close up to 44 of your elementary schools, some of which were the elementaries that eventually became Independence Mission Schools. Instead, our chairman, Ed Hanway, went to the Archbishop, and the Archbishop said there should be an appeals process around these 4 high schools that were going to close, one of which was our own Father Jim Olson School, Bonner Prendergast. The other were Conwell Egan, St. Hubert's, and then West Catholic, now West Catholic Preparatory. When the opportunity for there to be an appeals process came so that these schools could, quote unquote, be saved, the Archbishop actually said to Ed, who agreed, that they would underwrite the operating deficits. That's why these 4 high schools were going to close in exchange for operational control. When Ed agreed to be the chairman of an organization called Faith in the Future that would do that, he was already in contact with me and with others who said it would not be good just to assume 4 schools, which right now we're projecting a $6 million loss annually going forward. Well, why don't you take the whole school system? So what is a bit different from than Ann's story is, one, these are 17 high schools and the 4 schools of special education. And because these are schools that the Archdiocese owns, the Archdiocese can outsource the operation of it, which is very, very different, right? Fundamentally different than a parish. And we need to talk about that. I think that could be the most creative part of this conversation, is how do we get right the role of the not just the parish, but of the priest within the parish going forward. And that's different for us. And so what happened at that time, so that was now February or so of 2012. By September of 2012, I came here to town. We were projecting $6 million operating deficits, very similar approach to what Ann's describing. What are those things that all schools need? Therefore, no school should have to provide it for itself. And can you centralize those? What are the fewest number of things? So then the school can really focus on teaching and learning. Or also, as Ann rightly points out, so the school can really focus on its Catholic mission. So how can you bring better civic management to this Catholic mission is the challenge. And what happened in that time is we decided we need to focus on enrollment first. These schools were losing 1,300 children per year across the system at the time. And I can tell you now this fall what our enrollment numbers are going to look like, but they've been flat for the last 2 years. So instead of losing 1,300 kids, we're holding steady at around 13,500. Schools, as I say, as a system, we're projecting to lose $6 million. That projected loss has never occurred. And since that period of time, over the last few years, because of a focus on enrollment, the schools have actually accumulated a surplus across the system in excess of $6 million, which we're now reinvesting back into the school. So that's the focus on enrollment. The second is a focus on development. But instead of Faith in the Future raising the money centrally for all the schools, we figured better teach somebody how to fish, right? People give to institutions and they give to people. So we focused on teaching the schools how to raise more money. Schools on average were raising $12 million when we started. This year, they're projected to raise in excess of $20 million this year. So that's enrollment, that's development. And the last three, not surprisingly, are then what can you do to accelerate the academic program? We have to focus on people who really love teaching and learning and are absolutely committed to it, but in the new modern environment, which has changed. So that means we need to teach sort of what the teacher does, what the student experiences, and how that education is delivered. We can talk about that. In the fourth place, you really have to focus on academic program. If children are coming into these schools the way Anne describes, who are very different than the profile of children who may have been in these high schools 30 years ago, if they've been poorly served in the past, well, then we need to figure out how to remediate them. And also, we need to figure out how can you provide 21st century skills in a traditional Catholic setting. So that's the focus on educational programming. And fifthly, we focus on technology. So by focusing on enrollment, development, people, program, and technology, we thought we could stabilize the system. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what we think we can do to grow it. But that's sort of who we are. That's how we came to be.
Great. So same question as Anne. What, in the day-to-day, for those that are in the school, how does it look different? What do parents see that are different? And kind of what was the transition process like too?
So it's a very good question. What we want to do is we want to preserve what is authentic and best about the excellence and the traditions of the schools, while also recognizing that there are some aspects of the school, particularly where they were academically low performing and at an unacceptable level. We need to face that fact without fear. We needed to address it. So where Father Olson is now, maybe you can speak in a bit when we're talking, what have we had to do concretely, to address the academic program. But what primarily people see now that is different is I would like to suggest very little cosmetically. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to be easier for the customer to do business with. So instead of assuming that the children will just come from the 8th grade Archdiocesan school into the 9th grade Archdiocesan high school, instead of just assuming that you can compete and actually stay alive in an industry where the total number of children is declining and the parent has to pay for your product and they don't have to pay for the local charter school or the local public school. Anthony, I would say that experience is more customer centric. It's easier to know where the admissions office is. It's easier to understand the admissions process, and it's easier to understand what financial package will help make the education affordable. But as far as right now, what we're very proud of is that the sacramental life, the liturgical life in the schools, I would say, and I would really like Father to contribute to this later, is probably the same, if not even more vibrant than before. And what we need to do better now is we need to really dial up how do we make this education that is truly classical, truly liberal, but also delivered in a more technology-enabled way. And that hasn't changed yet, and that needs to change fast. So
Okay.
A little bit of what's different and what will soon be different.
All right, we'll come back to a few things. Beth, tell us, so you kind of cover, your thread kind of weaves through a couple of these topics. So
Yeah.
tell us, who are you? What's the Healy Foundation?
Who cares about it?
What do you do?
And then you kind of have two different projects. One is working with schools in a number of states, and then also across the river. What are you guys up to?
Yes. So the Healy Education Foundation was started by a South Jersey businessman named Bob Healy. Bob owns the Viking Yacht Company with his brother, along with real estate, energy, etc. He's the quintessential 85-year-old businessman that continues to work every day. I would be retired in Florida. He works every day, and no pressure to us sees this program as his legacy. So when he first started, he was giving scholarship dollars to families that couldn't afford Catholic schools. And what he found was that the schools were closing behind these scholarships that he was granting. And so through the true entrepreneurial lens, Bob said the business model's broken. And we've heard all about the broken business model and why, and the number of religious that are now teaching in schools and how the cost has increased. And, Bob said, nobody's focused on the business model. They're not closing because academics are poor. They're not closing because they're not Catholic enough. They're closing because there isn't enough money. Because the schools at the end of the year are going to the pastor and saying, Father, we need another $300,000, and he doesn't have it. So he said, and you gotta love Bob, it's as simple as this. Right, he'll say it's not rocket science. We're just gonna take what the universities and colleges and independent schools are doing, and there's really only 3 ways to get revenue: tuition, development, and the parish commitment. And what he saw was that schools weren't owning their own future, right? They were, well, we know what they were doing. They were closing. So the program that we have focuses on local control through a full-time advancement director in the elementary schools. The high schools have a full-time admissions person and a full-time development director. But that wasn't enough because frankly, the principal doesn't have the expertise for the enrollment or the development, and also doesn't have the time. So how do we not have a full-time person that's minding the shop, right, and being proactive in those 2 revenue areas? Oh, and by the way, that's not enough. There's expertise that we don't have in the principal and pastor that we need here at the school in finance and development and marketing and facilities. And so we need to create a board of specified jurisdiction. And to Bob, the specified jurisdiction part was really important because he said, and again, you gotta love the 85-year-old businessman, if you want successful businessmen to be on your boards, now his daughter is the president of our foundation, so she'll say, Dad, it's business people. Right, if you want successful businessmen to be on these boards and expect them to work and to give, they have to, their work and their decisions have to have authority. And so the schools that we work with have boards of specified jurisdiction. So you have local control, you have empowerment of the laity. Our program is extremely hands-on. It's a 3-year program. We're focused on those, the enrollment, the development center, and also the start of this governance model. Now, also keep in mind that these schools are schools that aren't serving low-income communities, right? These are schools that can raise money, that can find people for boards of specified jurisdiction. The answer from our foundation's perspective is a lot like IMS. In the inner city of Camden, there's 5 schools, and alone they were going to close. And so how do you bring them together and create a fundraising machine? Because that's what you need. You need the money to keep it going. And so there's a dynamic board in Camden. It's the Catholic Partnership Schools, and they too have focused on programming and making sure that the academic excellence is there to serve the children that need it and deserve it in Camden. So today we're doing that program in Camden. The model that I talked about first, we started in the Diocese of Camden, so Cherry Hill to Cape May, and now we're in Allentown, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and St. Paul, Minneapolis. Hopeful?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe same question in terms of so you're helping schools get their back of house in order.
Yes.
And their ability to basically help sustain themselves through development and kind of other pieces. What is it? Once they do that, and I know that they have to pay a little bit to buy into it. They need some skin in the game. What changes in the school? I mean, are they able to all of a sudden so they don't have this massive, concern about finances? So then they can focus on, what a principal, academics, faith formation, the whole bit. Are you seeing kind of an intangible with that?
Yes, it's a good question. So actually, the first thing, especially when you get board members together, they're like, we have to focus on the finances, right? We need to get this part of the shop in order. But the difference, I think, is in service to families, service to donors, service to, our schools are now treating the parish and parishioners and pastor like their #1 donor, because they are. And so there's this key difference in how they treat relationships and how they're proactive in those relationships, because that's the only way to be successful in enrollment and development. Now, our schools, I would say that sure, the extra revenue is helping them put programs in place. The first thing, even in these schools, is tuition assistance, right? They want to make sure that the school's affordable for the families that desire it. But we also push back to our schools and say, it's not just the money, right? There are people out there that can afford it. If we're going to compete on price, we're going to lose, so we have to compete on quality. I don't know, I'm continuing on, but I think it's in that relationship building where I find our schools being a lot more successful, and you can see that in increased enrollment, increased development dollars, and a board that's really involved and engaged.
Okay, excellent. So, hearing from the three different perspectives, there's a couple different pieces that are kind of held in common. Obviously, we're talking about things that are temporal concerns that have to do. They're obviously very important. Each of them mentioned if these things, if we're not smart about how these matters are handled, the schools are going to close, and then therefore the whole platform is lost. So although I talked to a number of my classmates and friends who are now ordained, all told me we didn't get into the priesthood to deal with balance sheets and dealing with facilities issues, but obviously it's still important to know. And so as you guys think about kind of how things were before the brink of closure to where they are now, what would you say? Let's actually tackle Catholic identity first and kind of the role of pastor. How has the role of pastors changed? How has it improved? What challenges were there? So, minor questions, right? Whoever wants to go first.
So I think the way it's changed is that now we have 15 pastors who are running a parish that is not saddled with the cost of a school, but has the presence of a lively, vibrant school on their campus. So I think it was a very difficult adjustment in almost every case of the 15 because of it just had to happen quickly. It was a lot of power shifting, and there was a lot of unknowns. I think there was a lot of fear. As it's turned out, it's been a major effort of ours to kind of really have these face-to-face discussions and say, how are we going to keep you engaged? Because there's like that relief, that financial relief, but in many ways it also translated into it's not my school. And, we're going to be hard pressed to keep a Catholic school going if that's how the pastor feels about it. So we've actually, we try to get our entire group of pastors together twice a year. And there's individual interaction. We have a board at every school. There are advisory boards. The pastor has a seat on that board. I would say of 15 schools, we have about 5 pastors who are very, very engaged. We have about 2/3 of our pastors who are minimally engaged, and we have 5 who have never come back to be engaged since we started this model. And so of our group that is pretty engaged, they've now put forth the idea that come up with a job description for sort of school minister. This is something that's been done at the high school level before. It's never been done at the grade school level that I know of, or that group knew of. But really to kind of go back to the pastor and say, it's a critical role. If you don't want to do it, would you agree to designate someone or let us find someone to do it? There's the feeling among the group that are very engaged that there's an audience of retired priests, other priests that don't have a school that would get involved in this. So that's kind of something interesting that we're starting to try, which I hope is going to get some traction. And I'll keep posted on that.
Great.
I'll jump in to build on that sense of faith in the future. We don't have the complexity of the parish relationship, but in front of you are 4 people who deeply care about schooling in America for all of the reasons that we care about schooling. Jefferson was right. Unless we're educated, we can't be free, right? So in schools, we give people the tools to their own true self-determination. But in Catholic schools, as Anthony said at the top, we give them the ability not just to be educated, but to be educated in the context that they are made in the image and likeness of God. Okay, and it's different kind. So we not just love schooling, we love the Catholic Church. And this is just the one reason why I was so very enthusiastic about coming here today and having this opportunity to talk to you all, is just as one man, I believe that if you want to fill the pews again, you need to fill the school seats again. Because we live in a time and place, and this would be a very good conversation if you want to go this way, where families need to be re-evangelized, at least parents need to be re-evangelized by their children. And if the pastor doesn't believe that, if the pastor is not totally sold on education, or if the pastor, tell me if this is just too, bold a way to say it, but if we can't answer the question, what is a school for? And what is a Catholic school for? And therefore, what is my relationship to this school and how does it be positive? If we can't answer those questions, then what we're trying to do, which is really ignite a Catholic school renaissance, where we believe we can provide the highest quality, low-cost education in America that actually reinvigorates the Catholic Church, at least that's what I think I'm doing, here. This is a huge opportunity, and it doesn't seem to me that is seen by everybody. That people, because we're now in a situation where the challenge to the pastor is so around these temporal issues. How do you not have this be the biggest headache in the world? How do you have this not just be, financially ruinous? Those are, I think, but because we're so challenged with those questions, we don't get to ask the other questions, which is what is truly a school for, and how can it be part of a life-giving, strategy, if you will, for the renaissance, not just of Catholic education, but of the Catholic Church in this country. I just wanted to toss that out there because our priests, and again, I'm going to ask Father Olson in a second to jump in on there. We have kids who get to go to schools that have the living presence in them. And they have benediction and they have mass and they get to say the rosary. That will all go away. We'll live in a country where that, doesn't exist. Or we can do something really cool and realize that the Catholic Church has given this gift to the United States of America by having great schools for so long, but that was in the face of Blaine amendments where we were providing for our own. And the question is now, why do we do this? Is it still part of our mission or not? So I just thought
Just say
throw out-
too. Yeah.
throw a few things.
I'm sure we're gonna just get things started.
Do my usual.
Did you want to answer that question too, Beth?
May I?
Yes.
Okay. So
Especially after that.
So especially in our elementary schools, right, the role of the pastor he is one voting member of the board. Now, we've talked to our pastors and we're like, so how do you feel about this now? Now, for our program, you have to want to do it. We learned that in Camden. We tried to make schools do the program that didn't want to do the program, and it turns out that doesn't work. So I think of one of our strongest pastors that, probably didn't need us. He would have had a strong school himself. And what he will say time and time again is, I'm going to leave and I don't know who's coming after me. And the way for me to make sure that everything that I've worked so hard to set up stays in place is through this board that I get to choose the initial members of. And, on that board, his expertise is Catholic identity, right? Like that's the expertise that we need from the pastor on the board. And I think, when we talk to our pastor, sometimes I think they forget how much their leadership matters to their communities. The people in the school and in their parish, they care about what they say. So when you talk about one of the biggest challenges for us in the elementary schools, for our pastors, and we hear it a lot, is how do you, we'll say, Father, you have to promote the Catholic school from the pulpit. People see that as your school, and if you're not willing to talk about how great it is, why would anybody consider attending it? And to a one, they'll say, but the percentage of families that send their kids to the public school is so much higher, I don't want to offend them. And so we've worked kind of one-on-one is, okay, what does that language sound like? Because we certainly don't want to offend anybody, but there is a way to use the leadership of the pastor that really matters to help promote the school.
So it sounds like, so obviously we're looking for a better, spending a pastor's time in a more meaningful way. Father, why don't we do questions in a second? Is it relevant to this or?
Everything I say is relevant.
Okay. I want to ask one more question, then we'll have 20 minutes of, and it's nice that the camera can't see you. It's the voice of God coming from behind. So the one other thing I wanted to point out is each situation, we're dealing with what's basically is a new a new information sharing model, which is basically networks, right? This is a network model that, a lot of people will say, there's no Catholic school system, it's a system of schools. That necessarily, it's the parish model, there's silos, there's not necessarily, information sharing amongst it. That is one thing that's not necessarily prevalent with your models. Give me a sense of how does information sharing change? How is that, what looks different as a network of schools instead of being independent schools? So that last question, then we'll go to questions from abroad. I think my sister-in-law just had a baby. That's why my phone is going nuts with pictures. So if you want to see cute baby pictures, send me up.
I'll address it quickly, but Anne can, really double down on this. I think it would be really this is a perfect question to end because, I think Beth and Healy don't necessarily believe in the network effect as much as maybe we're absolutely totally committed to it. So our slogan at Faith in the Future, or she'll, correct me if it's, wrong, is individually excellent but better together. As I said, what do all the schools need? Therefore, no school should have to provide for on its own. So information sharing, the one thing that we've just learned all across this country when you just study the great education reform that works is, this is going to be shocking to you, but it's the teacher, right? It's the number one driver of the indicator of academic outcomes for kids. There is more variation in the quality of teaching inside any one building in almost every school in America than there is in multiple buildings, meaning that the solution is inside every school. If you just open the doors and turn the school into a school for teachers, great teaching can take place. So you need information sharing inside the building. But if you come from a more of a parochial school background where each classroom is a self-contained classroom and they close the door, then you will have some children who are well taught by one teacher and another child who may be not well served by another teacher. So information sharing inside the building, but for us, it's dramatic information sharing across the network. So we've got all the material affairs. So around enrollment, but where's the market going? Where's the market growing? Where's the market declining? Being able to then segment the market is just not a way that people used to talk in the past. And so we do a great deal of that. And so then similarly, information sharing. All 600,000 of the living alumni of the Catholic Archdiocese and School System are now in one database. Well, that never existed before. 600,000 living alumni. This is a sleeping giant that can be, awoken. Just by us sharing that information among our schools, we find out that a man and a woman, the grandfather and the uncle, all contribute to different of our schools, and then we can make the case that what you want to do is give to the school, but also give to the network so that the network as a whole is stronger. So a great deal of information sharing, I guess, is one way to answer the question.
Great. Have you guys, either of you seen kind of the power of the network?
I would say, yeah, we've seen a lot of impact from the power of the network. So speaking to teaching, it's helped a tremendous amount in recruiting and trying to retain and develop that talent. So I think that it's just, we have a different generation of teachers that we're trying to go for, especially in the urban market. We generally are getting, new teachers. And being able to bring them into a wider sphere is very helpful. A lot of Catholic schools in our network are one class per grade. So they get in there, the person, they're in first grade, the person in second grade might have been teaching for 40 years. They may get on, they may not, they may have nothing in common. We can get this whole group together and they feel like they're a part of something, and that intangible value adds a lot to their job satisfaction. So I think that's a big thing. And I think from the outside world, being able to tell the story has been very powerful. So, you get a different audience and you get yourself into a different sphere by talking about serving 5,000 children than talking about serving 200 children. And it just makes things happen that are not going to be possible for one standalone school. And it makes people feel comfortable that there's a backbone to it. So our model is that each school is still its own operation, and there's a lot of autonomy at the school level. So they do not look like each other when you go from one to the other. But we're trying to set some common standards. Again, the flavor will be different in each building because the cultures that they're, that's their legacy are different. But to have this common backbone, it means we can take risk. And I think that's the other really important thing in the startup. When you're one school, without a lot of financial comfort, it's hard for you to take any risk, and we can take a risk. So when someone comes and says, you know, can you start an orchestra program, I can figure out, okay, I can do that because I can take a little money from here until it gets going, then I can go raise that money because I've got a portfolio. So, you know, next year I have 3 schools that are still budgeted to have a loss next year, but I can carry that because it's a very small loss and I know I can raise it at Central. So it just enables you to do a lot more juggling that gets you to the point where stuff can happen than if you're just sitting there with one set of, you know, operation.
Gotcha. Do you want to say one last thing?
And I would just say that definitely the network that's in the city of Camden, because there are times where we think a network makes a whole lot of sense. Definitely teacher recruitment and retention, and then hands down the ability to fundraise makes it. So I totally agree with what Ann said.
But I mean, not to jump in on Anthony's seat here, but could you speak a little bit to what is the power in your guys' model is with a board of limited jurisdiction or specified jurisdiction, they are giving more autonomy
Yes.
to that school, whereas in both Independence Mission Schools and Faith in the Future, these boards are more autonomous, but they're autonomous in the context of a network. And that, you know, that's a different strategy, right? And do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. It follows the idea of subsidiarity, that the best decisions that can be made locally should be made locally. And so yes, we have that bias towards schools that are not serving a large, you know, free or reduced lunch, a large low-income community.
So that's what we're trying to do, I think, in both Independence Mission Schools and Faith in the Future through the help of the Healy, you know, Foundation with that, is how can you push as much autonomy and decision-making down to the school while at the same time know what Ann is saying about the portfolio, allowing you to take risk, because with subsidiarity, some of our schools are deficiting today, but the network as a whole is in the black. Market will change 50 years from now. We want to build something that, you know, can last, you know, the eons of the church. And as that market changes, this other school will deficit, but those other schools that today are being supported, we believe they'll have the strength to then hold up the weaker.
All right, we're going to press time out because I think we've been talking enough. Why don't we see what questions you guys have? Father Peter, since you raised first, why don't we go and then we'll.
A couple of observations. First, I'm embarrassed to admit that your point, Beth, is absolutely correct. The priest is the critical problem in most instances. If you come to our evening session, we're going to talk about the priest as the principal PR agent for the school. And where that's not in place, nothing's happening.
I just want the record to show that I did not say problem.
I think I'm a good interpreter. And because I wear a collar, it's easier for me to say it than for you.
Thank you.
Huge opportunity here.
Yeah. That having been said, I get nervous when I hear terms like limited jurisdiction and boards. All of us are prey to the difficulty that we've experienced with Catholic higher education, where of the 237 so-called Catholic colleges, only 23 really can claim the name. And it's precisely as a result of the foregoing of jurisdiction to boards. And so my concern is how, again, I see the value, but I also see an amber light. In the Archdiocese of New York, a couple of years ago, they went to a regionalization model, which supposedly had broad consultation and input. We know how that works in the church, which means nothing really happened, and the decision was made before anybody was consulted. Ironically, priests who had absolutely no interest in the parish school are now livid at the fact that they have nothing to say whatsoever about the running of the schools, which have taken on a life of their own, completely autonomous for all practical purposes. So I want to know, with the Catholic higher education issue that we've had to suffer for 45 years, with models that are very similar to this in other places, that have essentially eliminated clerical jurisdiction of any kind, how we can negotiate those borders.
Sure. So we haven't eliminated.
But one vote for a priest I mean,
Yes.
it's the priest's neck on the line canonically and civilly.
So, so let me react to that. One, I know it's hard to push higher ed to this. Higher ed is just, it's so messed up. And there's this opportunity in elementary schools to start from scratch, which I think makes a difference. Now, the one vote, I will say, based on our operating principles, let me back up. The reason it's limited, because the board itself cannot vote to become non-Catholic or to have a different mission or to sell the property, right? That's why there's jurisdiction that's saved for the pastor. Now, in the event that the pastor wholeheartedly disagrees with the decision of the board, there's a mediation process that goes to the school's office and to the archdiocese. So there is that kind of fail-safe, for lack of a better term, in place, so that if the pastor would adamantly disagree. Now, we've only, in all the schools that we've been in, that's only happened once. And the issue was whether to have 1 kindergarten class or 2 kindergarten classes. The board got the 2 kindergarten classes. And I'm sure he'd be happy for me to say this. Monsignor Marine, he's in Philadelphia, Monsignor John Marine. He will talk about the levels of skepticism that he had about boards because of the boards that he has sat on. I think the difference is that we get to start it from scratch. And there's those things in the operating principles to.
What is the just jurisdiction of the board? I mean, you said it's limited, so maybe you could get into the details of that.
Sure. So the board has jurisdiction over finance. So they create the budget and set the tuition. By the way, when they set the budget, they have to have a conversation with the parish council or the finance council and the pastor because they need to agree on the parish commitment. You can imagine sometimes that conversation is nice and sometimes it's not so nice. So budget, fundraising, marketing, facility, they also have to work in conjunction with the pastor because he owns the facility. Typically, the pastor is happy for the school board to decide on facility improvements as long as the board can figure out how to pay for them. And then board membership. It's up to the board to repopulate itself.
I could put this in it. Well, I'll say one thing. A lot of donors that we work with, especially business leaders, one frustration they frequently share with us when they're invited to be on a school's board, it ends up not. I think it's more for show than. I mean, the frustration is when it is for show. They're given a role, but they aren't given any actual sort of decision input. It's an advisory board. It's not an actual operating board. I think that's a point of frustration. So I think that part of the rationale is how do we get people with competencies in certain areas to have actual input in how, like a corporation board or any other business board would operate, to give them the ability to have that kind of participation. Casey,
I'll only add 45 seconds to what Anthony just said. So Anthony, you want to get the benefit of real people with real skill, and you will not attract that if they're not giving them real power and real authority. So you have to balance that though with your very good and extremely sobering, right, comparison to higher ed. What has happened in higher ed in Catholic universities in this country is, unforgivable. So you have to then establish what you want in law, is Beth's point, and make sure that the limits on the jurisdiction are well understood. And there are, good bylaws and there are bad bylaws. So in the case of Faith in the Future, the absolute total kill switch is that if I, as the CEO or anybody who reports to me at any time represents publicly or privately, opinions or practices that are, outside Catholic faith and morals, we're allowed to be called on it and end the contract. See, that's pretty solid to have that kind of kill switch and then put limits on the jurisdiction just around taking on debt, selling the property, something like that. And then that way you can attract real people, but you can also make sure that you're sticking with your mission. How does that, sound to folks? Does that, address Father Peter's question?
I hope. I guess my question is, and the point was raised, and I agree wholeheartedly with it. When you look at it from a donor model at the parish school level, parish itself is the #1 donor to the school. The parish is giving the most money. And the pastor of that parish, being the priest, is in some of these instances being told, we're expecting you to keep up that same level of commitment. We're expecting you to pay as much as you've always been paying, to keep the money coming our way, to stay as our #1 donor. But you no longer have headship here. And the headship and pastoral exercise that you have over your parish is restricted to your church. And your school is something different. And I think when we start breaking down those, the parishes and schools as church and school, and there's a disconnect, especially at the headship level of the pastor. This is something that Father Peter got into. When the parish and the schools drift away from the parish and are seen as something separate from the parish or separate from the governance of the priest himself, very often it results in not only that breakdown of Catholic identity, but potentially even both the closure of school and parish together. And that's at least the concern that I'm seeing, especially when there is no longer a consideration that, you know, the school is as much of the parish, is just as much as the church is a part of the parish.
I would just react that the schools that we've seen with boards of specified jurisdiction, in fact, have helped the school-parish relationship become stronger, because the parish doesn't feel like it's just giving money when the school isn't doing anything for itself. You know, when you treat a donor, you cultivate them and you steward them if you're doing a good job. And so we've actually seen that relationship and partnership strengthen. And we also, I mean, we think it's really important. The other point that I would just make with especially the school board, is there are things that school board members can't do that you as pastor or priest can do, right? Like, they can't go and do a funeral for you. They can't go to the hospital for you. But what they can do is create a budget for you. What they can do is help fundraise for you. And also what we try to do is, we've heard, you know, from our bishop partners, with the decrease in the number of priests, how can the laity stand up and make a difference for what you can't, or what they can't do that you can do? Does that make sense?
I'd pile on that. Beth said in the beginning that the business model's broken. The positive way to say that is, how do you keep the living gift of Catholic education alive, but change, you know, the manner in which you deliver Catholic education so that it addresses the reality of a very different time. And all of this conversation is, if you change the governance, you can change the operating model, so you can change the outcomes. And the trade-off here is, well, if you're changing the governance, what are you giving up as a priest? And this is the real power of this conversation. We need to answer your question. How can it not be seen as giving up? But as what Beth is, I think, replying is, this is a better focusing of each person's skills. But you need to be, you need to have your question answered, you know, in your particular instance, to make sure that the school is, in fact, strengthened, and that you are the lead. But that you're not being the head of the board doesn't mean that you're, you know, abdicating your responsibility. It's your acknowledgement that a different structure will get you the outcome that you want. And we grant that's a challenge, and that can be difficult to accept.
So 3 questions over here. Yeah, why don't we start at the end?
I'm coming from a parish where I just left, but when the schools closed in the Archdiocese, mine was one of them. And we heard about some schools were allowed to stay open because they now became mission schools, and that caused a lot of anxiety and tension. I don't want to go too far off my track. We closed, and I accept that. Other schools stayed open as mission schools. Who do the parents pay the tuition to now? It's no longer to the school or the parish, right?
It's to the school. The school is a separate entity from the
Does
parish.
it maintain the name of the parish that it was in?
Yes.
Okay, so
It's, in the best instance, the parish still calls it our school.
yeah, I get that.
That's the best that's the best realization. So I try to circle around and go to the different churches associated with our school. And if I'm in church and they're saying, St. Raymond School, then it's all good.
Right.
If in that audience, they never say an Independence Mission School, it's working.
I wish St. Williams could have been one of those. I would have loved for that to have happened, and it did, but that's okay. I'm walking into a new experience now where there's potentially 500 kids in the school. I don't want to go through this again, and that's why I'm sitting at this conference. I want to put best practices into place where I am. I'm brand new. They don't know me. I don't know them. But it's a strong school right now. But 10 years down the line, if there's a demographic shift, like there was my last parish, what's going to happen? So I think I want to start now learning to do the right thing so I don't go through this again. Does that make sense to you?
I think that's
Absolutely.
great.
Well,
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, one of the
what
things.
school are you going to, or what parish?
Nativity of Our Lord of Warminster.
One of the things I think, Casey mentioned that we started at the same time, and there was a lot happening at once. And to be honest, running 15 schools in one network is huge, right? Anyone else who does it does 5 or 6 schools, and there's a good reason for that. It's like having 15 kids. It's kind of what I always say to people. But so we really had to focus on getting ourselves off the ground and proving that the model could work, right? And I think we've done that. And now we're about to do some strategic planning kind of for the next 5 years out. And a lot of that is okay. So 15 schools, right? 5,000 kids. There's 120 other schools in the Archdiocese. How do we take what we saw worked here and what didn't work here? And how do we try to, in the same way that the Healy Foundation has taken their work and started in a kernel and helped other groups of schools, how might we do that? And that could be any number of things. It doesn't mean every school has to become an Independence Mission School. I have a fairly strong opinion that we should keep the profile of a mission school pretty close to center because it makes it work, right? It's a model that works to serve poor children of all faiths. That's where it hums. Doesn't mean there's some things from that can't help lots of other schools. And honestly, some of them, it's not brain surgery, but it's the kind of thing, it's the thing we talk about is if you make it someone's only job, it's easier for them to do it. And in many ways, what I think we learn in mission schools is it's easier if you pull it out into its own thing. If you have to start from scratch, you're going to look around, look at the landscape and figure out how to start something. It's actually much easier than changing something, So I think we've learned a lot of lessons, and hopefully, part of our plan is to work very closely with the Archdiocese to say, what have we learned here? What other schools might be mission schools that make sense in the city? What have we learned here that might be transportable through working with partners to help other schools?
So 2 other questions over here, then we'll wrap.
I was in kind of a fortunate spot where I was at one of the high schools that was closing while the Faith in the Future Foundation was being formed. And I was living at a parish where the school was closing that became an independent mission school. So I had fun, like, all over the place. But I did get to watch how that formed, and then I was part of, how that worked. The thing that I think the watchword for me anyway was humility. As a priest, I did not give up my leadership role. And I was figuring, like, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I'm just smart enough to know who to listen to, who knows what I don't. And that really helps me a lot. And what I found when the Faith in the Future started to run the schools is that it gave me what I did not have in terms of business expertise, knowledge and understanding of how things work, how to economize. Even, when I first got to my high school, it was $800,000 in debt. That's not the most money in the world, but that was a pretty big number for me anyway. And how do you handle that? Well, there was a stack of spreadsheets that big. Most priests, some are great, but most priests are not really good numbers guys. I'm not a good numbers guy. And I tried to plow through those. I couldn't make heads or tails. I was able to get a guy who came in. He can read spreadsheets like we read the daily news, just flipping through, and he found 12 accounts for me to watch. All the rest of me said, you don't have to worry about them. because they're either fixed income or you can't control them anyway. But you watch these 12 and you'll get out of debt. Within 3 years, we were out of debt, and I was only watching 12 accounts. That's what it brings. But I had to have some humility about saying, I don't know this. Here's what I learned too, is that, at least for the Faith in the Future, is that they also had humility. And this is where I think as priests or as pastors, when it comes to who we accept onto the board, they have to have that humility as well. Ed Hanway is the chairman of the Faith in the Future. He was the CEO of Signet. He really successful guy, very smart, but he's also smart enough to know what he doesn't know. And he's not interested in education in the sense of the nuts and bolts of it. He's not going to tell the teachers how to teach in their class, those kinds of things. He knows how to run, the foundation, and he does what he's good at, lets us do what we're good at. I do think that the one thing that Archbishop Chaput did here that was really smart was he was very attentive. You would be more involved in that, but he was very attentive to the mission, the statement. What is it that this foundation is about? And then anyone who's on that board has to be, before they get on the board, faithful to that mission. You're faithful to what it is you're supposed to be doing. It does kind of cut out, I think, Father Peter, what we use it with a lot of the colleges, what I noticed over years is where that's gone astray, is where there was a fuzziness of mission. So then the board they didn't have anything that they could be held accountable to in terms of Catholic mission. So now all of a sudden they could be free to run amok. If there's a strong sense of mission, I think that's mitigated.
Great, perfect. I think one more question.
Yes, one of the things I was interested in was parishes and pastors don't always have the kind of control over the situation of their schools or even churches in relationship to the entire diocese. And dioceses have school boards. And my question is, what has been your experience dealing with the diocesan school boards in relationship to the way in which you propose these new models?
That's a great question. So our agreement with the Archdiocese is basically that we are entitled to the services that the Office of Catholic Education delivers. So the curriculum, basically any service they deliver, but we are free to use it or not use it at our decision. The control in the agreement is that the Archdiocese is the sole arbiter of Catholic identity in the school. So, if they say this does not fit our Catholic identity, we can't do it. We have not really hit any issues with that. And there's the boards that exist on the elementary side in the diocese have been in a state of, I think, transition and formation, right? We go to they're basically county boards. They're working on bylaws to be of limited jurisdiction. We go to that, but I would say we've been pretty separate from them. I mean, we attend their meeting. They have not have treating us like another region or another county. They've kind of, there's not been a lot of like, why are you doing this or why are you doing that? They're more grappling with, their numbers have not turned, right? So they're still really grappling with trying to turn the tide on their numbers and their stability. And we're just kind of a little bubble to them. So really answer your question, but that's kind of the state of it here.
Your question is a very good one, and it is very difficult to answer in the current state. What Anne has is a school board that is responsible, right, for all of these schools, even though each school has its own board. Is that right?
Yeah, I have
Sort
a
of
governing board
rolls up to a
at the
governing
independent
board.
special school level.
Similarly, Faith in the Future has a governing board, and even though through the work of Healy and our own work, each school is going to have this board of limited jurisdiction, That's rolling up to Faith in the Future, which acts as the school board that you're asking about. What is difficult in the current state here in Philadelphia, as Ann was just alluding to, there are the 122 elementaries, one of which is Nativity in Warminster, which really doesn't have a single board that it can report to. There is this, elementary, Board of Education. I happen to be of the opinion that if you were to have an analog to Faith in the Future, one board that then all the others could go to, you'd have a plant that was hanging on a hook, that was hanging on a ceiling, and everything would be rock solid. As it is right now, it's really kind of hard. Your question is a good one, and it poses a challenge to the current environment. I think, Father, for you to address your concerns, we should all stay in close conversation, because if there are schools that aren't bought into this kind of model that we're talking about, and if schools continue to close, just because we don't have the benefit of looking at it from a higher elevation, that's the challenge of being in school, is you're only looking at it at your local area. The benefit of going higher is, as we talked about, the portfolio effects. But if there isn't a strategy, this is your question, what is the relationship to if there isn't a strategy at a board level like that, no matter how good the effort is of an individual school, it could be compromised.
And for our program, so I think about Allentown. Their school board, the diocesan school board, actually found us and asked us to come and talk to Allentown. Other places, a funder might have brought us in, but eventually we're talking to the diocesan or archdiocesan school board. Because in order for us to have boards of specified jurisdiction in individual elementary schools, we have to have a partnership with the archdiocese or diocese first, and the archbishop or bishop must sign off on those operating principles. So we do a lot of work up front with the diocese that we partner with to make sure that that's clear to all of the constituents that need to be involved.
So I think we're,
And just one question, a simple statistical one. Do you have data on percentage of Catholics before and after the switch of governments?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't have reliable data exactly for percentage of Catholics before. I will tell you, so our enrollment's grown by about 20%, and our non-Catholic percentage has grown. Across the network, we are about 72% non-Catholic. And I don't know what it was before IMS, but in my first year, it was about 67. So it's grown slightly under our management in terms of non-Catholics.
I guess the piggyback question is, anything in terms of substantive conversions through the schools?
We don't track that on our side. And I think because the children are young, where we would see that happening, so about 74% of our graduates go on to archdiocesan high schools, and sort of anecdotally, that's where that invitation would be made to them because of their age. So we don't see a lot of families converting at the elementary level.
So we do keep that data, and across the whole system, 80% are Catholic. Philadelphia happens to be much more, Catholic than any other Catholic school system in the country. In the inner city, we have 8 high schools in the city and 9 in the suburbs. They are 66% Catholic as opposed to 80% Catholic. And in our 2 schools that have the largest percentage of non-Catholics, we are seeing a significant number of conversions. We're seeing more vocations to the priesthood in the suburbs and more conversions to Catholicism in the inner city. That's about all I can tell you.
good. So we've sufficiently gone over long enough, but Casey, Beth, Ann, thank you for coming. Why don't we take about 5 minutes, and we'll get reset for the next discussion. Feel free to hound any 3 of these before they head out if you want to ask further questions. Thanks, folks. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. It just
It just turned off
stopped.
there.